Okay, folks. So just to get some stuff out of the way, the paper, like I said, is going to be due of that. Obviously, you can turn it in any time before that. Test is available Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And it's going to follow the same rules, 25 multiple choice questions. Once you get in, don't get out until you're done. And everything is going to be very similar to what we had before. The test is fairly evenly divided between, what was on the first test, what was on the second test, and the material after the second test. Okay. So let's start from the beginning. Basically, if you were to study for the final, the way I would do it is I would go over the old tests. Okay, so look over test 1, look over test 2. If you took the makeup, look over the makeups and the quizzes. And that's going to help you a great deal, I think. It's straightforward. It's not going to be no tricky questions or anything like that. So you should be in good shape. I think you'll find it very easy. So let's get going. Let's start with opportunity cost. What is opportunity cost? Well, once you do something, you give up something else. Well, whatever you give up, the activity that you did not pursue because you pursued another activity. So what you gave up, that's the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost comes about because there is scarcity. And obviously, as a nation, if you produce something, you cannot produce something else. You have something, you give up something else. So there's the opportunity cost. Now, I showed you the PPC, the production possibilities curve, and I showed it to you as a straight line PPC and as a bowed out PPC. In the case of a straight line PPC, we have constant opportunity cost. In the case of bowed out PPC, there's increasing opportunity cost. So here, this PPC shows constant opportunity cost. And if I showed it to you as bowed out, this shows increasing opportunity cost. All right. Then we looked at supply and demand. And supply and demand shows the relationship between price and quantity supplied and price and quantity demanded. In the case of price and quantity demanded, we have an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. If the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. With supply, if the price goes up, quantity supply goes up. If the price goes down, quantity supply goes down. So we have a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied and an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So let's put up a supply and a demand curve. here's the supply, here's the demand, and equilibrium price, or how the book likes to call it, the market clearing price, which is the same as equilibrium price, is the price where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So don't say that supply equals demand.
Professor, could you repeat that? Your video froze.
Okay. At equilibrium price, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So don't say supply equals demand, say quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Okay. Now, if the price ends up above equilibrium price, then we're gonna have a surplus. And if the price is below equilibrium price, then we're gonna have a shortage. Okay, now, if supply changes or demand changes, you're going to be able to determine what happens to both new equilibrium price and new equilibrium quantity. So let's suppose that for whatever reason, the supply of a product increases. Well, you're going to shift the supply to the right. And you can see that the new equilibrium price is going to be this new equilibrium price, P1, and the new equilibrium quantity is going to be this quantity, Q1. So if the supply changes, we're going to have a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. If the demand changes, the same thing is going to happen. We're going to have a new equilibrium price and new equilibrium quantity. And you're going to be able to tell me what happens to the new equilibrium price and quantity. In the case where I shifted supply to the right, I increased supply. Let's say that demand decreases, demand for a product decreases. What happens to the new equilibrium price and quantity? You can do it with a graph or without a graph. If the demand for a product decreases. Well, let's see. Here, I have the original supply and demand, and then the demand for a product decreases. As you can see, price is going to go down and quantity will also go down. So you can determine what happens to both. If we have shift between in both supply and demand at the same time, then you're not going to be able to determine what happens to either price or quantity. One of them will be indeterminate. In other words, one of them could go up or it could go down or it could stay the same. So you don't know where it's going. And the way I asked you to do those type of problems is you do the shift in supply and see what happens to price and quantity. Then on a separate graph, you do the shift in demand, see what happens to price and quantity. Then you put them together and you're gonna notice that one of those two variables, price, quantity, one of them is pulled in different directions. That's going to be the one that is going to be indeterminate. And the other one is going to be consistently going in one direction, either up or down, so you know where that one is going. Okay. Now, let's suppose that the government wants to change the equilibrium price. They determine that the equilibrium price is too low. This equilibrium price here is too low. Well, what will the government do in order to make the price higher? They will impose a price. Anybody tell me What is this? A price floor or ceiling?
Price floor.
It's a price floor, exactly. Because the floor stops the price from going here at equilibrium, and it stops it above equilibrium. So remember that a price floor goes above equilibrium and a price ceiling goes below equilibrium. If they were to impose a price ceiling that is above equilibrium, it would have absolutely no impact on the market. You would still have the equilibrium price here prevailing in the market. So a price floor has to go above and a price ceiling has to go below in order to have an impact on the market. Okay. Moving on to calculating some taxes. Well, what kind of taxes there could be? There are flat taxes, which are called proportional, progressive taxes, and there are regressive taxes. Can anybody give me an example of a regressive tax where the higher the income, the lower the marginal tax?
Social Security.
The Social Security tax. Social Security tax is a regressive tax. Okay. And an example of a progressive tax would be the income tax, So let's calculate, let's do a problem for calculating taxes. Let's say that a person makes $41,000. The income is equal to 41K, $41,000. My question to you is, how much do you owe in taxes to Uncle Sam? What is the tax burden?
$100.
$100. You're absolutely right, because the first $40,000 is taxed at 0%, so you pay nothing. But then you're going to have to pay taxes going from $40,000 to $41,000. So you're going to pay taxes on $1,000. And since the tax rate is 10% on that $1,000, you owe 10% of $1,000 or $100. So the tax is equal to $100. And if you were to calculate what is the average tax rate, you would take how much you owe in taxes, divide by your income times 100. So in this case would be $100 divided by $41,000 times 100. Okay. Very good. We talked about calculating GDP. What is GDP, first of all? Well, is the value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time. Okay. So GDP, the way we calculated it was via the expenditure approach or via the income approach. The expenditure approach was C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. This is equal to GDP. This is the expenditure approach. And we can also calculate GDP via the income approach. And that was wages plus rent plus interest plus profits plus depreciation plus indirect taxes. Okay. So this is the income approach. If I give you C, I, G, export and imports, you can calculate the GDP. If I give you those here and I throw in some of those from the income approach, what are you supposed to do with those values here? Exactly, ignore them. Just don't add them in just because they are there. You use the formula and you cannot make a mistake, okay? So you probably will see something where I give you C, I, G, exports and imports, and then you calculate the GDP. And if you see some of those here, just ignore them. Okay. Differences between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP includes the inflation. Real GDP does not take the inflation into account. It accounts for that inflation. So there is no more inflation because with real GDP, all the GDPs are in 1 year's prices. So there are no differences in prices. The differences in GDPs only come from differences in production. So that's why we care about what is the change in real GDP from year to year, because we want to find out whether the economy has grown or not whether the prices have gone up or not, okay? So with real GDPs, prices are no longer relevant. Very good. We talk about fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is what the government does to move the economy in the desired direction. Okay. So let's suppose that we have an economy that is in a recession. So therefore, we're going to have a recessionary gap. So here's short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And the long-run aggregate supply is going to show us where the economy would be at full employment. So let's say that it's here. That means that the economy, the actual GDP is here. And full employment GDP is here. So we are having a recession. This is the recessionary gap. And what the government would want to do is to stimulate the economy in a positive way to create more demand for goods and services. In other words, shift aggregate demand to the right, like this. And they can do that either by increasing their own spending, increasing government spending, and or lowering taxes on us. So we're gonna stimulate aggregate demand. This is called expansionary fiscal policy. So remember, folks, please, that fiscal policy has to do with either government spending and or taxes. So it involves taxes or government spending, one of those two. Please do not put in changes in the interest rates. That has to do with monetary policy, or changes in the money supply. That has to do with monetary policy. So let's not confuse monetary policy with fiscal policy. Okay. Now, we also discussed the fact that there is a spending multiplier. In other words, any increase in government spending or in investment or in business spending, any increase in spending is going to get multiplied by the spending multiplier, which was equal to 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or another formula was 1 divided by MPS. So if you know the MPC, you know the MPS, because if the MPC is 0.9, the MPS is equal to 0.1. If the MPC is 0.8, the MPS is equal to 0.2. So any change in government spending or change in investment is going to get multiplied by the spending multiplier. And that's going to result in the final change in the GDP. So in the past on the test, I told you something like, well, there's an increase of let's say $100 million in investment. Investment goes up by $100 million. And let's say that the MPC is equal to 0.8. What is going to be the change in GDP? And you say, okay, this is 100 million times 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8 is equal to the change in GDP. And you have 100 times 5 equals 500 million. That's going to be your answer. Okay. So depending on what the MPC, you're going to have different changes in the GDP. Okay. All right. Now, we also talked about, well, is fiscal policy that powerful as we said that here based on the multiplier? And the answer is not really, because there are other things that are happening at the same time, such as the crowding out effect. And the crowding out effect basically says that increases in government spending are offset by decreases in the private spending. Okay. So that's one thing, the crowding out effect. The other one was the open economy effect, which said that increases in government spending are offset by decreases in exports, in net exports. So government spends more money, but foreigners spend less money on us. Does anybody remember how come the increases in government spending were offset by decreases in foreign spending? And the reason was that when the government increased the spending, they did it by borrowing money, by issuing bonds. So this caused the interest rates to go up. And then foreigners want to buy those higher paying interest rates, higher paying bonds. They want to get paid more in interest, and they buy dollars, and the value of the dollar goes up, and that makes our goods more expensive to them. And as a result, they buy fewer of our goods. Okay. So we had the crowding out effect, and we had the open economy effect, which caused fiscal policy to be a little bit not as effective as it would otherwise be. Okay. Also, keep in mind that fiscal policy may take some time to have an impact on the economy. And there were the time lags that caused fiscal policy not to be very effective. In other words, we had the recognition time lag, we had the action time lag, and we had the effect time lag. And those three were causing fiscal policy to take quite a bit of time before it actually impacts the economy. Now, we had two distinct views of fiscal policy. One was the Keynesian view, and the other one was the classical view. Can anybody tell me who was in favor of government intervention, Keynesians or classical?
Keynesian.
Keynesian, right. In Keynesian economics, yeah, the impact of fiscal policy has a great impact on the economy. With classical economics, since they have the opinion that the aggregate supply is vertical, only impacts on of fiscal policy will be on price level and not actually on GDP. Who view that wages are especially sticky downwards? In other words, if the economy goes into a recession, wages tend not to go down.
Keynesian?
Keynesian, right. So classical model, again, fully flexible prices and wages. In the Keynesian model, wages tend to be sticky downwards. And that was, at least in the Keynesian times, it was due to the long-term union contracts, which prevented wages from going down. Okay, very good. Monetary policy. Monetary policy is pursued by the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank. And monetary policy, just like fiscal policy, can be expansionary monetary policy or contractionary monetary policy. The Fed would pursue expansionary monetary policy when the economy is in a recession. And they would pursue contractionary monetary policy when the economy is overheated. So the economy is doing way too good, they will pursue contractionary monetary policy. If the economy is struggling, then they will pursue expansionary monetary policy. So what were the examples of expansionary monetary policy? One was to lower the reserve requirement ratio on banks. In other words, banks would not be required to hold as much cash on hand, and therefore they can loan out the excess reserves, and hopefully that money will go out into the economy and they will buy goods and services. Another one was to lower the interest rates. And another one would be to buy bonds on the open market. Buy government bonds. So they buy those government bonds and they are buying them with cash. So there's an infusion of cash in the economy. Okay. And remember that any money that comes into the economy, that money will actually multiply. And we have a formula for the money multiplier. Any idea? Remember what is the formula for money multiplier? It had to do with the reserve requirement. And it's equal to 1 divided by RR. So any infusion of cash, any change in the reserves is going to get multiplied by the money multiplier, and that's going to be the final change in the money supply. So if the Fed, for example, buys 100 million worth of bonds, initially $100 million goes into the economy, but the person, whoever sold the Fed that $100 million worth of bonds, they're getting the 100 million and they're putting that money into their bank account. And then the bank can make out loans up to, let's say, 90%. And somebody else gets those loans and they will deposit that money in their bank. And now they can write checks worth $90 million. And the bank is going to take that 90 million and they're going to loan it out, 90% of it. And somebody else now can spend $81 million and so on. So the money is going to multiply by 100 million, how much the initial seller of those bonds can now, they write checks for $100 million plus 90 million plus 81 plus 72 and so on. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, the money multiplier is going to be equal to 10. So this 100 million times 10 equals $1 billion. So the final increase in the money supply is $1 billion. So again, we have a money multiplier, and that has to do with the banking system. We have the money multiplier due to the fact that we have a fractional banking system. Fractional banking system means that the banks only have to hold a fraction of their deposits in the vault or with the Fed. Okay. Let me give you a problem here. Let's have a little bit of a problem. This has to do with trade, international trade. First of all, let me ask you this question. In order for trade to take place, what do we need to have? We need to have absolute advantage or comparative advantage?
Comparative advantage?
Yes, comparative advantage, right. Comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. Let's do this problem. Jack can do 2 loads of clothes while Jill can do 8 loads of clothes in 1 hour. Jack can do 1 load of dishes while Jill can do 8 loads of dishes in 1 hour. As far as absolute advantage, who's better?
Jill?
Jill is better at both doing clothes and dishes. However, between those two, where is Jill's advantage? So let's take a look at comparative advantage. Comparatively, between clothes and dishes, where is Jill between those two? Where is Jill's comparative advantage?
Washing clothes? No, I'm sorry, washing dishes.
Washing dishes. So Jill is 8 times better at washing dishes, but only 4 times better at washing clothes. So between those two, Jill's advantage is in dishes, and therefore Jack's advantage is in clothes. US and Romania. Cars and TVs. Absolute advantage in both goods to the US, absolute advantage. But we want to look at comparative advantage. Does Romania have a comparative advantage in one of those goods?
In cars? I'm
In
sorry,
cars.
Romania
Yes,
has
yes.
a comparative advantage in.
Well, wait a second. Let's see. Wait a second. Let's take a look at cars. US is better than Romania, right? How many times is US better than Romania in cars? 2. US is also better than Romania in TVs. How many times are they better than Romania in TVs?
About 1.5, 1.6.
Yeah, so it's less than 2.
$1.6 times.
1.6. Okay, very good. So comparative advantage to the US in cars, and therefore comparative advantage to Romania in TVs. So if the US has it in cars, then Romania has to have it in TVs. So this is the simplest way of doing those type of problems. Okay. And if I had said something like this, then what would you say in this case?
Neither has a comparative advantage, so we wouldn't trade.
Exactly. There is no comparative advantage. There is no reason to trade. And the reason for that is because the prices are the same in both countries. So they have no reason to go and trade with each other. Okay, very good. If the Fed is selling government bonds on the open market, what kind of monetary policy is that? If the Fed is selling government bonds on the open market?
Contractionary?
Contractionary monetary policy, contractionary monetary policy. Because when the Fed is selling bonds to the public, what they are doing is they're giving the public those pieces of paper, those bonds, and they're taking the cash because the public is buying those bonds with cash. So cash is flowing out of the economy, is going to the Fed, and the Fed is not spending that money. The Fed is just holding on to that money. And we're no longer having that money. We now have bonds, which we cannot spend on anything. We cannot spend those bonds on new cars, new washer and dryers, new refrigerators. Okay. Very good. Very good. If the government is increasing taxes on us, what type of fiscal policy is that? Increasing taxes on us.
Contractionary?
Contractionary fiscal policy, exactly. So expansionary fiscal policy is increasing government spending or lowering taxes, and contractionary fiscal policy is lowering government spending or increasing taxes, or some combination of the two. Very good, very good. Who do you associate laissez-faire economics? Keynesian or classical?
Classical.
Classical, right. Because it says, leave it alone, leave the economy alone, no government intervention. There's no need for government intervention, and we associate that with classical economics. Very good. Okay. Okay, well, let me